Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Doug Dorst. Hey, Doug, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing great, thank you. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Doug Dorst is the author of the best-selling novel S, a collaboration with filmmaker J.J. Abrams, which was published by Mulholland Books in 2013. His other works include the novel Alive in Necropolis, the story collection The Surf Guru, and the play Monster in the Dark, created in collaboration with Fool's Fury Theater in San Francisco. He was also a staff writer on the Amazon show Z, The Beginning of Everything, and he directs the MFA program in creative writing at Texas State University in San Marcos. And we're going to be continuing what's turning out to be a little bit of a mini-series about the out-of-the-box story. And I'm calling this the literally out-of-the-box story because we're going to be talking about S. I have my big copy of S here. And I thought it would be fun to start the conversation out. I discovered S because I was doing some reading about a potential guest. And I found this on Zachary Pettit's webpage. Zachary Pettit is a journalist. And it says, the article is called The Amazing Design Experience of S in Print Magazine. And he says, at first, the quote at the top of the press release for the book S might seem odd, over the top, a lazy misuse of celebrity. S is unlike anything I've ever seen. Frankly, I'm amazed it was even possible to do this project at all. J.J. Abrams. And Pettit goes on to say, blurbs are meant to be given by a book's own authors, especially when one of those authors is, in this case, a major Hollywood creative, known more for directing and producing. It seems like a cheap trick until you hold a copy of S in your hands, and it really is unlike anything you've ever seen, and it is indeed amazing. And so I agree. I had so much fun with this book, and I think there's so many lessons that we as writers can learn about this. So, Doug, I wanted to just start out asking you to describe how the project that ended up being S came about.
It fell completely out of the blue for me. I was walking down the street and I got a call from my agent asking if I might be interested in doing a project with J.J. Abrams, which is not the kind of phone call one gets every day. So I said, sure, let's see what this is about. And
can I just ask how they knew to call you? Like, did you have an association with him before? How did that come about?
No, not at all. So, I mean, it's even more inexplicable. It took me years to figure it out, I think, but my first novel had made the rounds for film and TV rights. And a person who was working with JJ at Bad Robot had encountered it. They didn't end up getting the film option, but apparently there was something about the writing or the approach to character and voice that stuck in her head. So when JJ had the idea to do the project and they were kicking around who they might call, she offered my name. And there's a lot of good fortune involved there. That's for sure.
And talent for you to have captured their attention. But I'm sorry, I interrupted. So please go on after that phone call.
Oh, yeah. So they pitched the concept to me. JJ, I think, was leaving LAX and he found a copy of a Robert Ludlum novel on a bench outside. And it had a note, I think, on the inside cover that was addressed to whoever would pick up the book next. And it was sort of engagement with the next reader. And he got to thinking that was really cool. And wouldn't it be fun to tell a story in some kind of communication between readers of a particular text and try to capture the joy of reading and of sharing what you're reading and of connection over narrative and books in particular. And so they said, what would you do with that concept? Come up with a pitch for us. And I did. And I will be honest, I had no chance whatsoever. I was certain that they must have talked to 25, 50 people, and I was just probably wasting my time. So because I thought that, I kind of decided, let me make it the most absurd, outlandish, potentially fun and self-indulgent thing that I can and pitch that. And they liked it. And so we spent about 1.5 years talking about characters and themes and just what the experience of the book would look like. And so what I came up with was a source novel by this fictitious, probably Eastern European author from the early 20th century. And it's two people passing the book back and forth and communicating in the margin notes to each other as they study the book, study the author. I realized, I'm not really good at thinking things through, but it was only after we signed the contract.
I'm going to pursue that statement in a little bit, but please go ahead.
It was only after we signed the contract with the publisher that it really dawned on me that I had just agreed to write 2 books in a really short period of time because I had to write the source novel also. And I was Well, I'm in deep. I better get this done.
Well, I think that's a great entree. Can you just describe a little bit what the product is, what you get when a reader gets S? And you're talking about 2 storylines, but in a way, there's even more than that. Like, I could almost identify 4 storylines that you're telling. So can you provide a little bit of background on that?
Sure. I guess first, the physical book. The book itself doesn't have my name or JJ's name on it anywhere. It's only those are only on the slipcase that the book goes into. So the book itself is supposed to feel like this copy of Ship of Theseus by V.M. Straka that one of the characters stole from his high school library a few years back because it was his favorite book. And now he's a grad student who's doing research on the author. There's a lot of mystery around the author. No one knows exactly who he or she was. He or she was a rabble-rouser, pretty radical, an enemy of the economic machine. So I wanted there to be some stakes in terms of like figuring out who this was. What is the story behind this person's appearance and, in fact, disappearance in the late 40s? So the pages are distressed, or there's a simulation of distressed pages. And the S novel, the conversation between Jen and Eric, the 2 readers, it sort of happens in the margins, and it's not all sequential. So they might be writing on page 100 and then a month later be writing on page 26. But the comments are color coded as if they're just using this one pen at a particular time. It needed a little bit of an organizational aid, I suppose. That was one of the places where we sacrificed verisimilitude for the reading experience. But it's them going back and forth. The idea is they're leaving it for each other in the library stacks because it's too dangerous for them to communicate in any other way about it. Because of course there's an international conspiracy. I mean, how could there not be?
Was there an order in which did you write the Ship of Theseus story first and then work the margin comments in? Or how did you organize that in your mind and in actuality?
Well, I didn't organize it. I'm not a very organized thinker at all. But at least as far as the process, I did the prologue and the first chapter, Ship of Theseus, and then the margin notes to kind of get a foothold and do a little proof of concept for the publisher. And then after that, it was just get to the end of Ship of Theseus, write the source novel. And I did a couple drafts of that before I ever went back and started approaching the margin notes. Although, as I was writing it, I would make notes to myself about how the Eric and Jen story might be fitting in, or what I was learning about the story of Straka, the author, as I was writing his book, or her. So, but then because we had talked a lot about the characters and talked a lot about the themes, it was pretty easy to layer in the margin notes when it came time to do that. I knew what their story was, and I knew what they would be responding to in the source text that would trigger this little exchange between them in the margins. That actually ended up being quite a bit easier than I thought.
And
maybe it's because I just had a lot of it in mind as I was going through the source novel, but it was sort of set up. It had the receptors for it.
Well, it is interesting to think about it in terms of if you separated out all the stories and you wrote the Jen and Eric story independently, then I think that the Jen and Eric story isn't complying with any kind of standard story development chronology, I guess, because for several reasons. One is that to an extent, it has to be driven by whatever's happening in the Ship of Theseus story. But also this idea that you had mentioned that you go back and forth. It's not like you can read the marginalia from the beginning to the end and see it unfolding.
Right.
I hope this is clear to people who haven't read the book yet, like what I'm talking about. But you would mention that on a certain page, you might have a combination of comments that Jen and Eric made earlier, and then they come back and they're reading it again and they make more comments. It just seems like it would be incredibly difficult to manage yet another sort of thread, because it's the Jen and Eric thread, but multiple times through the story.
Yes. And And sometimes I got tangled up. And this is not the only way in which our editor helped us. We worked with Josh Kendall at Mulholland, who was just a dream to work with. And he took what was a particularly chaotic mess of fun ideas and story threads and helped us kind of get it into shape. And then the two of us worked hard to make sure that everything lined up, and JJ sort of oversaw that process. So
I just picture a room with like millions of Post-it notes on the wall.
If I were a more organized person, that's probably what it would have looked like. But really, it was like stacks of paper just everywhere. And if I had to go hunting for something, I guaranteed it would take an hour. I knew that organization would be helpful, and I'm just not wired that way.
So was the editor sort of serving that purpose for you?
No, both he and JJ were saying, do follow your instincts, write the stuff that your story brain is telling you to write, and don't worry too much about it being a mess, because you've got backup and we'll sort of help sort it out where we need to. And that's great. To write something that is a total adventure into the unknown for yourself, and do it knowing that you have this incredible safety net of two brilliant spotters working with you, because they're both geniuses with story, and you can't lose in that situation. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like you can run straight at the risk and embrace it, knowing that you're not going to ruin it.
Yeah.
Because there are other people, who are going to keep you from ruining it.
I just want to detour momentarily from S and ask how that experience has panned out for your other books. Like, do you always find that there's some resource there that enables you to run right at the risk? Or was this unusual in having that kind of support structure?
I've never had a support structure like that. I've always had close first readers, close friends, colleagues. My wife's a good reader for me. The people that I went to grad school with, some of them have remained close readers for me. So I've never been sort of adamant about working alone. I know I'm better when people are reading things and challenging me on the story as it's evolving. But this was next level. This was two people who were really focused, two people really good at what they do, with also a slightly different perspective. Like, neither of them is an MFA program, is a product of that world. So JJ's coming at it from film, Josh is coming at it from publishing. And I think there were some really nice synergies there too. So I talk about running at the risk like it's a really easy thing to do. I do well when I do that. And it's sometimes still a little terrifying to do it. And I'm not always able to, much as I would like to be.
I suppose it's sort of an encapsulation of what every writer does when they pick up a pen or pencil or put their fingers on the keyboard, but in a much more sort of exaggerated way in this case. And the other thing I think is interesting, among the many things I think are interesting about this book, is that there's not only the multiple storylines, and I want to talk about those more in a little bit, but there are also all these, like the Daily Pronghorn, which is the newspaper of the college campus on which the story takes place, a ostensibly torn out page that has ads and articles beyond the article that you're supposed to be reading to better understand the story that you're reading it as. So did you write all that too? Like all those auxiliary pieces of material that were included in the book?
Yeah. The newspaper was particularly fun. All of that happened after the text of the book was locked. So it was really just in the few months before the publication process was going to start. We had known that we wanted to have artifacts or ephemera to go with the book. And we didn't really plan it specifically at the beginning. JJ just said, like, as you're going along, keep a wish list of stuff that would be cool to include. And my wish list was kind of ridiculous. I had a lot of like bulky 3-dimensional objects in there, as opposed to things that can be tucked in between the pages, which of course makes a lot more sense. And both JJ and Josh said, when the book is done, we'll be able to tell which of the inserts will advance the story and heighten the experience of reading it, as opposed to the ones that are just self-indulgent or not terribly interesting. And we all came to agreement pretty quickly. Like, that was a smooth process too.
I'd been looking for my favorite piece, which was the map that's written on a napkin. I'm not even going to try to unfold it at the moment, but there's a question I have about the actual creation of this stuff. But I think that the thing that was really appealing to me when I read that review that I started our conversation off with is this idea of the tactile experience. And I think this is becoming really attractive to people, maybe even more so than it was when the book first came out, because I think everything is so virtual now that this idea of, I'm going to get something, I'm going to hold it in my hands. And when I open it, there's like a postcard inside it. It's like, talk a little bit about that, because that must have been very intriguing to you too, to think about working on something like that.
Oh, intriguing and just right up my alley. I mean, I'm not a technophobe and I'm not against electronic publishing in any way. But personally, I can't read books that way. I need a physical book in my hand. I need the tactile experience. And in this, we also had the chance to sort of heighten the tactile experience. So the texture on the cover, the texture of the pages, like and the texture of each of the artifacts, like those were all things that, that got consideration, and that everyone else involved in the project was having fun with it too. Because I mean, that was JJ's mantra for the whole thing, was like, let's make the coolest, most fun thing that we can. And that applied to everybody, to the designers, to the editor, to the people who are helping us do the online stuff that accompanies it. And I don't know, maybe this is a melodramatic or whatever, but I think you can feel the joy in it. And I think a lot of that joy is connected to the action that's involved in it. I mean, we're all readers. We all love books. And what a perfect project for all of us to be able to bring that love and energy to making a thing. Yeah, it was, at the risk of sounding totally cliched, but I mean, there was something kind of magical about the collaboration. These things don't necessarily need to go well. Personalities don't necessarily need to fit, and often don't. And I mean, it's not like there weren't differences of opinion, but everyone got it. And everyone, I think, understood intuitively where the ship was going.
So to speak.
Yeah.
So you were saying that in the end, when you had your big wish list of things you wanted to include, and then there was a discussion about what was realistic, what was appropriate for the book, were there any things that were included, not because they necessarily advanced the story, but just because they were going to be fun, or it was intentionally there because you wanted a red herring?
I would say, I guess I should probably be, if this were 2013, I'd be being evasive about this, but I think it's safe now. I would say there are some things that are more atmospheric and aren't necessarily connected or aren't essential to the storyline or any of the puzzles that are included in the book, because we haven't even talked about that. There's a whole situation with puzzles in the footnotes and in the text. So yeah, there are a few things that are for atmosphere. There are a few things that are like the newspaper is there for a reason, but it's also got a lot of fun built into it. The napkin, that was Josh's idea. I have to give him credit on that. Everyone loves the napkin. And it's what he said, like everyone loves maps. We got to do a map. And
I think it's a combination of, I certainly love maps, and also the fact that it is one of the things that is most surprising from a actual logistical point of view. As I was reading through it, I thought, did they have someone who would have a big stack of postcards from Brazil and they would all turn to page 137 and they would stick the postcard in? And I could kind of imagine how all those things happened, except for the napkin. Maybe it wasn't actually a napkin, but it certainly looks like it. And, with ink writing on it. Like, how difficult was it? Were you involved at all in the production side of these things? And how did that play into the decision about what got included?
I was not so much. Like, by the time we were getting to those decisions, I was just neck deep in the book, trying to get everything finished and locked up. But it was produced as piecework. So it is a person putting things in between particular pages. I don't know about the napkin specifically or how radical that was for them to produce. But as you can imagine, it's also something that's very expensive to do. And I believe it was done in China because I think that's where it could be done most cheaply, which I'm glad they could do it. I can't say that part of the book is like a radical anti-imperialist economic message. So there's an uncomfortable irony there. But yeah, so that's where it took to get it done. There were many, many production decisions that were very expensive, borderline ludicrous. And the publisher was willing to do it because part of the reality is it was JJ's project. And so I think they could rely on a certain predictable amount of sales. And so they could risk the money on the production and sort of follow his and our instructions to make it the gorgeous thing that seeks to perpetuate the illusion of it being an artifact every step of the way without corners cut more than they have to be.
Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at the Indie Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/the Indie Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. So can you talk a little bit about, on top of all this other complexity, there's a mystery going on. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, so there's a mystery. There are several mysteries going on. There's who, in fact, was Straka. And I tried to build this whole mythology around it where they're like, in the same way that people argue, like, here are the 10 leading candidates for Jack the Ripper or whatever, and there's evidence for each. And I thought that would be fun for one of the characters to get really deeply involved in. But then there's also the Ship of Theseus, the book, is accompanied by footnotes from its translator, who was people believe, a sort of associate of Straka's, who may or may not have actually known who Straka was, but helped these manuscripts get published. And there is a relationship between that translator and Straka that is sort of building through those footnotes and through some of the clues in the codes and whatnot. And that was not something we planned at the beginning. That was kind of improvised. I just kept getting more interested in the translator. In a way, she's kind of at the heart of the story to me now.
Yeah.
I mean, assuming it's a she. I think that there's actually doubt about who the translator may have been. So that's the thing. It's like mysteries got to sit on top of mysteries. And I was never told to rein it in. I was told go nuts and not like be outlandish for the sake of being outlandish, but if the story is steering you into, really, really strange and complicated places, don't necessarily turn away, which again is like great to have that behind you. So I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not actually answering the question of the mystery, like the footnotes in the way that you.
Well, and I don't want you to answer it too much because, as you said, if people go out and get this, then they should be able to experience it without too many hints. But there are several mysteries going on. And as far as I could tell, some of them were not resolved. And it may just be because at some point I sort of stopped reading for the mystery and I was reading for the experience of the book. And it's hard to explain how I'm differentiating that. But I didn't, even when I'm reading much more conventional murder mysteries, let's say, I'm very rarely reading it like I'm going to guess who done it before the end. And I'm more reading it to see what the author is doing to plant red herrings or to set certain people up and then to back off those. Like I'm reading more from the learning craft point of view. And I think that was true here. But do you know the answers to all the mysteries that were posed in the book?
Yeah, I do actually. I might be the only one who does. But, honestly, I'm exactly like you. I get what you're saying, that for me, it's often about just sort of like the music of the experience more than the specifics of the mystery. And because that's kind of how I lean, that's a little bit how they function, which is to say, there's the chewy mysteries for the people who want them, and they're not so essential that someone who is reading for the music of the experience will get tripped up by missing them. We try to sort of get it in the pocket there between the two. So, I mean, on some level is a hardcore puzzle head, perhaps not going to find as much satisfaction as they might if that were the primary goal. Yeah, probably. But that's where we decided to try to locate it.
Yeah.
But I'm the same way watching movies too. My wife is the one who's 20 minutes ahead. She knows exactly what's happening. And I'm like, I'm here. I'm watching.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I don't know, there's something just tasty about the ambiguity too. And philosophically, like I feel like we should be encouraging the embrace of ambiguity, of constructive ambiguity, of
Yeah.
the not entirely knowing the prepackaged, like not having something totally prepackaged in exactly the way that you expect and even think you want. I don't know. There should be some.
Yeah, I do like it. And that was another interesting experience I had with this book because I'm generally someone who loves to get to the end and have that surprising yet inevitable ending. And then I would love to be able to go back to the beginning and read through it all and see all the points where the author set up that surprising yet inevitable ending. But when I got to the end of S, I think in part because I had gotten into the experience more than I was getting into the story, I got to the end, I was like, I kind of really don't know what just happened. But I liked that because it was more like I just picked up a book in the library that happened to have marginalia and interesting stuff in it. Like the fact that it was more like life in that sense, that for me, on the first reading, it didn't have this very clear, wrapped up ending, was an attraction. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's the ending of the Jen and Eric story, which is, there is a point at which the conversation is getting to its most recent point. Like you can tell where on the timeline it stops. Whether it stops on a note that is a happy ending or a sinister one sort of depends on how you hit one particular moment. And then there's the ending of Ship of Theseus, it's a 10-chapter book where each chapter is it turns out doing a slightly different thing. But there's some question as to whether the chapter 10 in your hands is the actual chapter 10 that Straka wrote. And would Straka's be different, or is it a hybrid? So in a way, that's kind of a curveball to throw people when they're getting the end of the book, because you have to figure out, wait, who's the author here exactly? And what are the motivations here exactly? And are they different from the 9 chapters that preceded it? Which, if I were giving someone advice, I would say, don't do that. That's insane. And it's likely to disappoint people because you're sort of changing the terms of what they've been investing in. I mean, I would hope that it changes the terms in an interesting way. It was interesting to me. But there are other iterations of chapter 10 that are available only online. One of which I will say affirmatively is Straka's true chapter 10, and is the sort of end of the Ship of Theseus experience. It's just not the one that's in the book, which again is ridiculous. Like I admit, and like looking back, it's like, oh wait, if you write an ending for a book, maybe it's better to have it be in the book. So more people find it. But so anyway.
What was the conversation about not having that in the book? Is that a decision you made? Was it a decision you made with the editor and JJ?
It's a good question. I don't specifically remember. I mean, it must be something that we talked about because it absolutely affects how chapter 10 plays. Yeah, I think it was my inclination because that became an important part of the story to me. Like the question of authorship beyond the question of who is Straka, but the question of authorship of these parts of Ship of Theseus. So I probably argued for that. Well, I wouldn't say argued, but advocated for it. And they let me do it. So you know what? I would love to ask Josh, like, why he let me do that and see. I think JJ thought it was cool, but Josh is the publishing professional who really should know better. I will, if you're interested, I want to know, but I'll find out.
Yeah. Let us know. That would be great.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump back a little bit to another topic we talked about, which was the different points of view. And so you're reflecting the voice of each of the point of view characters slightly differently. In some cases, it's in the Ship of Theseus book. In some cases, it's in the footnotes that the translator wrote. In some cases, it's in the marginalia, especially for the Jen and Eric parts, the notes that are in the margins. Was that different at all from the experience of writing a more standard point of view character?
Oh, yeah. I mean, because it all has to come through. Well, so much of it is dependent on the voice. And if the voice falters for a moment, you're sunk. You know what I mean? Because that's, it's essentially like voices talking to you from the page. I mean, that's my experience in reading it anyway. And it's also, it makes it really difficult to render action, right? Because any action is only going to be reported by the character after the fact. So there's going to be a filter that's going to, frankly, make any feeling of immediacy difficult to achieve. I would like to think that I found ways to address that. There are probably a couple moments where that stretched a little bit, but I really did want to avoid any of the sort of expository plotting in the margins. Like, here's a thing that happened that I'm going to narrate for no discernible reason, except that I really wanted to avoid that. And there's one part where I feel like I got too close, but yeah.
Well, one of the things that I liked about it is there were some parts where you would read something and it was exactly as somebody would write a note the way it's presented, but it was, as you're saying, not the way it would be. Like there was a reference to a fire taking place and you're like, fire? What fire? And then you read for a while until you kind of get an idea of what the fire was. But the other thing I loved, which is unusual, we've been talking about out of the box things, is that the Jen writing is almost, you could tell like as a child, she probably put little hearts over her eyes. And then Eric is like the printing that you see on architectural diagrams. So even the way they write, even their handwriting in this case, got to be a real reflection of their personalities.
Absolutely. And it's the designers, the folks who designed the book, just two of them, one took the Eric part, one took the Jen part, and they came up with the handwriting styles. But I mean, all of us, when we saw them, we were like, oh yeah, that's Jen, that's Eric, of course. And, all of those notes are handwritten. So the style of writing is part of the characterization, but also it's not static. Like when one of them gets excited, you can kind of see the writing change. So it's also like capturing the emotion of that moment, and it's great to have access to that. And it's one of the tools that I felt like we needed to sort of help create some of the feeling that you would be able to create in more standard ways in a more standard narrative. But I mean, credit to them. They did an amazing job with that. One of the foreign editions of it. So, I mean, it's supposed to be everywhere. Like each foreign publisher has like two people from the design team doing that. There was one where they tried to do it with a handwriting font. And it looked fake. And you can just tell, like, I don't even read that language very well, but you can just tell like all the heart is sucked out of it. There's nothing, I don't know. It's too consistent. And in fact, actually, contractually, they were not supposed to have done that. And they did it. And there were angry phone calls from New York and Santa Monica. And I don't know that they ever published a correct version of it, but the people in charge of the project made certain that no one would make that choice again, which is great because it should be handwritten.
It would have been a totally different experience because as the edition I have has that sometimes they get to the bottom of the corner of the margin, they're starting to write real tiny because they're running out of space, and then they'll have like big arrows to somewhere else. And you're like, oh, I read that note earlier. I shouldn't have read that earlier. Yeah, I think that was part of the fun.
And that's how my brain works, frankly. Like you asked about organization.
Yeah.
My system of organization is like arrows to wherever I need to go. And
a little star continued up here.
And there's no consistency to it, or there's not as much consistency as a person with an orderly mind might.
One of the things that I thought as I was reading is this idea that you have two people who are going to the library. We can suspend disbelief a little bit that they never actually ran into each other. They were putting the book back on the shelf with their latest notes. But did you see any reaction during the pandemic of people like reviewers or commenters experiencing the book differently because it's a scenario that was easier to imagine for oneself during the pandemic, this idea of physical separation, but an attempt to reach out to people?
That is a really good question. I honestly don't know. I kind of stopped reading about the book pretty soon after publication, just because it wasn't doing me any good to really stay abreast of how people were responding to it. Just because when people are enjoying it, it's like it's cotton candy. You enjoy it for that moment. And then you're like, okay, yeah, but where's the negative thing that's coming next? And then it comes next and it crushes you for a while.
Yeah.
So I've kind of steered clear of it in recent years, certainly through the pandemic years. But I would love to hear other people's thoughts on that. It'd be cool if it did change people's experience of the book in a way that they found significant. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know.
I wanted to wrap up our conversation with to bring this back to more a learning experience for our listeners and viewers. And there's one area where I imagine it's not going to be very applicable, because if you don't have J.J. Abrams behind you, you probably can't put out a book filled with postcards and ephemera in a box. And I think that's something that indie authors and even traditionally published authors, that's kind of lightning in a bottle. You can't say, you know what I'm going to do next? I'm just going to do a giant book filled with postcards and things like that. But I'm wondering if you can talk about if the experience of having written a book that's as unusual as S is impacted the work you did subsequently, and if it did, how it did.
I mean, I've always been a sucker for formal experiments like that. I mean, pretty much since my earliest days of trying to do this, that's fun for me. From like Donald Barthelme, like the postmodern stuff, like just demolishing form and expectation and writing in fragments, or love the challenge of trying to being handed a constraint or a form and say, okay, tell a story using this. I mean, I love the challenge, which is why it's particularly fortunate for me that this is the thing that dropped into my lap. Here, do this project with awesome, famous, and amazing people, and do the thing that you love doing most. I'm lucky. I mean,
yeah,
it's crazy. But yeah, I mean, I'm always on the lookout for finding narrative in different forms. It's not that everything I do makes use of that, but I'm always on the lookout for it. And there are other ways. So yes, there's no way that S would have existed the way that it does if it were just a Doug Dorst book. And if the publisher did not have like the security of it being a J.J. Abrams project. That's just, the economics of it. But there are ways to do sort of more lo-fi formal experiments. There's a book that came out, I think it was like late 60s, maybe early 70s. It's by a British author named B.S. Johnson. It's called The Unfortunates. And it's like 17 little pamphlets that independently bound that come in a box, and you read them in any order. Or I think like they're published in that, like they're not all stacked in the same order. I think and how you experience a story totally depends on the order in which you read them. It's a wild book. And what's that? Okay, there's some more staples in binding, and yes, got to put it in a box, but it's not outlandish. It's not like making incredible production demands, I don't think. But I'm still playing around with some ideas like that. I think there'll be some more broken form stuff that comes out, or altered form, because it's fun.
Yeah, I think that's maybe indie authors would almost have an advantage there, because they're not necessarily tied to the production processes that traditionally published authors are. And if they wanted to run down to the Kinko's or whatever the current version of Kinko's is and get 17 little pamphlets or chapbooks or something printed up, then it might be easier for them to do that than not.
I mean, there's something about the freedom of not having particular external expectations or obligations thrust upon you. I would say, yeah, if it's a great time to just go nuts and write fearlessly. It seems to me that it's better to err in that direction than to write something safe from a position of fear in which you're imagining a theoretical audience that probably doesn't exist in the way that you're thinking about them. Like, you don't know how your readership's going to compose itself or how their minds work. I don't know. Okay, I take that back. I mean, there are kinds of books that actually, the point of them is like hit these beats and do these things in the way that people expect. And that's fine. That's exactly what they're supposed to do. And people who do it well, do it really well. And I guess for me, there's something kind of electric in the doing something that's like slightly out of your control every step of the way. that, I mean, I know my best stuff comes from that. The moment that I try to dial it back and start writing with a particular audience and a particular set of expectations in mind is the moment that the life goes out of my stuff completely. I wish it were otherwise. But I'm sorry, it's a really rambling answer. You're trying to wrap things up. But I mean, I guess I would just put in a plug for like, unless you are really sort of trying to write for a particular form, do whatever you can to avoid writing from a place of fear or tension or where you're imposing an imagined set of expectations upon yourself. Because, I don't know, I mean, only limitation is going to come out of that. Again, unless you're doing a different kind of work.
Well, I really like that. I think you answered the last question I was going to ask, which was looping back to something you had said earlier about the power of thinking that you don't have a chance and that you would kind of let yourself go because you were expecting that JJ was approaching 50 other people to, just pick one from a group. And I think that's all part of it, both the not letting yourself write from fear and also the power of thinking you don't have a chance. Do you want to comment on that?
The freedom of inadequate self-esteem. No, I don't know. It might be that there are people who that there are people who can just like channel that adventurous spirit from a place of confidence. And I'm going to edit myself because any way that I express it generally would have some expletives in it, but it involves like forget it. What good could come of this? Let me see and have fun while I'm doing it. One could argue that like I'm writing from a place of privilege where I've got like institutional backing. I've been to an MFA program. I've taught. I've been affiliated with universities. I've had a major publishing deal. So maybe it's easy for me to squawk about just writing with abandon. But I see it in my students, the ones who are just letting it go and not writing to what they imagine the workshop sensibility will be, but just doing their stuff their way, doing it big and loud and crashing and burning if they need to crash and burn. The people taking the chances, it's every semester, that's the most electric work. And not to say that there aren't really successful stories coming from a slightly more conservative compositional place. I mean, of course there are. But if you're wired at all like me, and not everyone is, then the place of risk and the unknown and the slightly out of control is the best place to live artistically. Well, for me anyway. Yeah.
Well,
I don't want to make pronouncements.
No, I think that is a lovely piece of advice to end on. And Doug, thank you so much. This has been such a fun conversation. And please let the listeners and viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Well, I have a website that's in terrible condition right now that I have not been paying attention to. That's dougdorst.com. I really don't think people should go there anytime soon. Maybe this summer. I'm not teaching, so I'll spruce it up. And maybe by the time this airs, there'll be something.
And I encourage people to go on our favorite online bookstore and look for S, because I think it is just such a fun experience.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. Great to have the opportunity to talk about it.